Okay. Okay, so hello. Before we start, let me get a quick show of hands. So how many of you have experience developing web applications? Okay, cool, nice. So my name is José Miguel. I'm a software engineer at Shopify, and today I'm going to be talking about the Remix framework. So what is Remix? Remix is a full-stack React framework to develop web applications, which means that you are basically going to be able to build both the backend and the frontend of your web applications with Remix. Most of today's web applications are single-page applications, so I would like to start by analyzing the flow of a document request in a single-page application, and then compare it to the flow of a document request, but to an application built with Remix. So here we have the flow. I will explain everything in case that you cannot read it. On the right side, we have the events that happen on the client, and on the left, the ones that happen on the server. And it starts on the top right with the user entering in the client, with the user entering the URL. Then the server receives the request and returns a static file. Then the client, well, the browser, renders the HTML that it's in the static file, and then starts fetching the JavaScript of the application. Then, as it is a single-page application, the JavaScript application will take care of the routing, right? So depending on which route was requested, it will render one component or another, of course. And those components will probably need some data. So the client will start fetching data from the server. And lastly, the application will render the application in the components in the browser, okay? And here we have a real screenshot of a document request done to the Gmail web application. It starts on the top left. The small blue box is the document request. And we can see that after the initial document request, the browser starts fetching all the JavaScript files, which are the small yellow boxes. And here at some point on the bottom right, the application starts to fetch some data from the server. Here I just want to show you that this is really how production applications like Gmail work nowadays. And now let's talk about progressively enhanced single-page applications, okay, which are the kind of applications built with Remix. In this kind of applications, the baseline is a functional application event without client-side JavaScript, which basically means that as soon as the client receives the HTML, the user should be able to start using the application, right? So the user doesn't need to wait to receive the JavaScript to start using the application. It should be already functional. And this is called progressive enhancement. The main benefit of this is not that JavaScript is not needed. The main benefit is that the mental model here is way simpler, and we will see this later. I'm going to be talking about this more. So again, here we have the flow of a document request, but in this case, for this new kind of applications, and again, we start on the top right with the user entering the URL. Then the server in this case doesn't return a static file. The server is going to take care of the routing. Then depending on which route was requested, it will fetch the data dependencies for that specific route. And also, the server will render the components here already in the server. So we are doing server-side rendering here in the document request. So at this point, the browser renders the HTML, and the HTML is already the final HTML. So the user is going to be able to see the application already and start using it. So, well, later the client will start fetching the JavaScript of the application, but with the goal of improving the experience of the user. But if for some reason the browser blocks the JavaScript, or there is a network error or whatever, it's totally fine. The user is going to be able to use the application. And here we have a visual example, which I've taken from the official website of Remix. On the left, we have an application built without Remix, and on the right, one built with Remix. Both start with the document request. We can see the network at the bottom. Without Remix, the document returns very fast because it's a static file. And then the browser starts to fetch some data. Okay, it's a JavaScript file, the second line. With JavaScript, it takes longer to receive the document because it's generated, or it's doing server-side rendering. But as soon as the document is back on the client, the user is able to see the application already and can start already using the application. So this is progressive enhancement. Then at this point, Remix will start fetching all the JavaScript of the application to improve the experience in parallel. Without Remix, after fetching the initial JavaScript of the application, the application will start fetching also the data dependencies to continue rendering the application. And if the application is doing code splitting, it will continue fetching all the JavaScript. So we can see clearly here that how, without Remix, in a normal single-page application, the network is like a waterfall. And with Remix, apart from the document, everything is loaded in parallel. Okay, so we are removing here waterfalls in the network. Apart from this, after the document request, both kind of applications do client-side navigation, right? So we don't do a document request for each navigation. Okay. So how does Remix do it? Thanks to nested routing, which I would say is the main feature of the framework. And nested routing is the idea that each segment of a URL can be mapped to three things. First, to a specific part of the UI, so to a component layout, a JavaScript bundle, which is needed to render that component, and the data dependencies that could be needed also to render that component. And this is easier understood with a visual example again. So here we have a web application. We have the URL on the top, and the URL has 4 segments in this case. Let's have first a quick view of the mapping between the segments and the components of the UI. We start with the root segment, okay, and it is going to basically grab the whole application. The second segment, which is sales, it's going to be mapped to the main content. The third segment is mapped to this secondary content, and lastly, we have the invoice ID in the URL, which is mapped to only this small part, okay? So we can clearly see the mapping between the segments and the components in the UI. Apart from this, it's very clear the JavaScript needed to render each part, each segment of the UI, and also the data dependencies, right? So we can see this for every segment, okay? So with this, Remix is able to fetch all the resources in parallel. Okay, there is no waterfall here in the network. Remix can fetch everything in parallel here. Also, in this case, if the user, for example, click on any of the links on the left menu, Remix wouldn't refresh the whole page or reload these resources. Only the main content will change, will be updated, right? And again, here, if the user, for example, clicks on any of the links in the top, only this secondary content will be updated, right? So the rest of the application stays consistent, and so we are basically saving resources here. Okay, and now let's go with the live coding example. So I'm going to switch to the editor. Can everybody read the code, or should I make it bigger? Yeah, okay, cool. Okay. So I'm going to be building a note-taking application, right? Something very simple for the example. The application is going to be able to display some notes, and also the users in this application are going to be able to add new notes. Okay. To store the notes, I'm going to store the notes in a JSON file just to keep it simple. I have here 2 example notes. Each node will just contain a title and some content. Okay, something simple. Then I also added 2 helper functions for the example. One to read from the JSON file and to get the notes, and another one to add new notes to the JSON file. Okay, it's not important. It's just that I'm going to be using this for the demo. Okay, so the logic of the applications in Remix is inside the app folder, and every Remix application comes with the root file, which is basically going to be mapped to the root segment of our URL, okay, in our application. So this is the first React component that is going to be rendered in the browser, and we can see that we have complete control over the HTML here in the root, and then all the other nested routes will be rendered replacing the outlet. Okay, the outlet is just a React component that comes in the remix package, and we can use it to create more nested routes if needed. Okay, so now let's add some routes to our application, and to add a new route in Remix is as easy as adding a new file in the routes folder. So I'm going to basically add the index in this case, and these files have to, the default export has to be a React component. Okay, so I'm going to create a React component here and return something simple, a title. So welcome to Remix. And now if I go to the browser and if I refresh, okay, so we have here the index of our website. Let's add a new route, in this case to display the nodes of our application. So the route is going to be nodes / and then the index. So again, let's export a React component here. Okay, let's add a title. So I'm going to keep everything simple for the demo. So let's check that I successfully added the route. Okay, cool. So we have two different routes or pages in our web application, but we are navigating by changing the URL here, and each time that we change the URL, we are doing a document request. I don't know if you can read here at the bottom the network, but well, basically we are doing a document request each time that we enter a URL, right? So this is what we saw in the document request flow. So let's add some links to navigate between the routes. And what I'm going to add the links here in the root, because I want them to stay consistent, to appear always in our application. And I'm going to use the link component, which is a component that it's included in the Remix package. And it's basically going to render an anchor tag. But the main difference is that anchor tags by default do a document request when the user clicks on a link. But in this case, Remix is going to use the Fetch API, which is a web standard, to basically to do client-side navigation. Okay. So this is going to be a link to the home, and then I'm going to add one to the notes page. Okay, well, I'm going to add just some margin. I'm using Tailwind for these styles. Okay. Okay, cool. So we have now the two links. So you can see that if I click on the links now, well, I'm going to show you that they are just anchor tags, nothing complex. It's very simple. And here in the network, we can see that we didn't do a document request, right? So here we are now doing client-side navigation. We are just fetching the JavaScript needed for to render this new route. Okay, this is what I said before of the mapping between the segments of the URL and the JavaScript. Okay, so now let's display the nodes here in our nodes index route. Okay. To declare the data dependencies of a specific route, we have to use a function. We have to export a function called loader. It is a special function that is only going to be executed in the server. Okay, so this is going to handle well, here is where we are going to define the data dependencies. So here I'm going to read from the JSON file, and I'm going to use the helper function that I added before. And loaders have to return a response object. Okay, the response is just part of the Fetch API. So again, it's a web standard, nothing special. But instead of setting up the headers and everything, I'm going to use a helper function from Remix because I want to export, to return JSON content. Okay, so basically this function is just creating a new response with JSON content. That's it. Okay, so now we've defined the data dependencies for this route, and we have to read now this data. We need to get the data in the React component. To do that, we can use a hook called useLoaderData, which is part of the Remix package. And this hook is basically going to return the data that comes from the loader. It's going to connect automatically the loader with the React component. Okay, So now we can just render the nodes. So let's just let's render the title of the node. Let's render the content of the node. I have to add a key. I'm going just to use the title. Okay. Let's go to /nodes. Cool. So we can see here that we are successfully rendering the nodes that come from the JSON file. And if I refresh just or enter the URL manually, we can see here at the bottom that we did a document request. Okay. And in the document, maybe you cannot see it, but in the document, the nodes are already there. Okay, so the server is taking care of fetching the data and rendering the React component already in the server. So yeah, so here basically we are not fetching any data from the client. Everything comes rendered from the server. But if we go to the index and use the links to navigate, so we are doing client-side navigation, we can see that when clicking on the link, we are fetching some data, okay, which is basically the loader. So here we are getting the nodes, and it's just a fetch request, and some JavaScript, again, which is the React component needed for this route. Okay, so, well, here we can see that it's clear, the mapping of the segment with the data dependency and the JavaScript needed, which is the React component. So now we can do things like prefetching the data or the resources in advance for that specific route. And it's very, very easy to do because with the link component, there is a property called prefetch. If we set the value to intent, what this is going to do is that when the user hovers the link, Remix is going to prefetch all the resources of that route. Okay, so I'm going to hover, I didn't click, and if you see on the bottom, there is a request, a get request, which is the data dependencies of that route, and the JavaScript, which again is the React component. So now when I click on the link, the navigation is done instantly because the resources are already in the browser. And this is very, very easily done because it's very clear, the data dependencies and the JavaScript for a specific route. And if we had nested routes, everything would be fetched in parallel. Okay, there is no need to do a waterfall here. Okay, so now let's add a new route, in this case, to add new nodes. Okay, so let's export a React component and return something here. So, well, let me add a title. Okay. So the way of sending data, because here what we want to do is that the user enters some data, and then we send the data from the client to the server. Okay, so the way of sending data from the client to the server is just by using forms, which again this is a web standard, nothing new or special added by Remix. But instead of using the default form, I'm going to use the one that comes in the Remix package, because by default forms, when you submit a form, it does a document request, so refreshes the whole page. But in this case, it is going to use the fetch API, right? So it's not going to refresh everything. It's going to do client-side navigation, okay, again. And it's basically to improve the experience. It's totally fine if you use this form. It's going to work exactly, it's going to work fine. But to improve the experience, if the browser allows it, we can use this form. And I'm going to set the method to post, because I'm going to be sending data to modify some data in the server. And to not lose time here, I'm going to copy the content of the form, and just to show you what I added. It's very simple. I just added a text input for the title of the node, a text area for the content of the node, and then a button to submit the form. So very simple, nothing special here. So when we submit the form, it's going to trigger a post request to our server. So now we have to handle this request. To do this, we can define a function called action, and actions are only going to be executed in the server, okay? And with the actions, we are going to handle post requests, okay? So actions receive the request in the parameters, okay? And it's a normal request, part of the fetch API. So we can now do things like reading the form data of a request, as we would do with other requests. It's asynchronous, so I'm going to use await. And so here now we have the form data, right? So we can now do things like reading the content, the input of the user, like this, as we would do with every other form, right? And then here we can read the content of the node. And I'm going to use the helper function that I added previously to modify the JSON file. Okay. And actions have to return a response object. Again, part of the fetch API. To not set up everything, I'm again going to use a helper function from Remix, because now what I want to do is redirect the user to the to /nodes. Okay. So after submitting the form and adding it to the JSON file, the user will be redirected to /nodes index and will be able to see the new node. And yeah, so let's try it. Let's go to /new. Let's, well, just to show you, we can see that it just rendered a form, okay, with the method post, and the action is pointing to our route. Okay, nothing special here. So let's add a new node, and let's submit it. Okay, here in the network we can see that we did a post request. Well, maybe there is no space, but we did a post request, okay, using the fetch API. You can see here that, well, it says there that we are using the fetch API, and if we see the content or the body of it, we are just sending the form data. That's it. It's very simple. And apart from that, we got redirected to /nodes. If we scroll down, we can see that the new node was successfully added. And actually, if we open the JSON file, and let me format it, yeah, we can see the new node here in the server, in the JSON file. So it was successfully stored. And yeah, I want to show you also that I'm going to disable JavaScript. And now I'm going to refresh the page. And here at the bottom, we can see in red that it's blocking the JavaScript of our application. But as we are getting here in the document request the final HTML containing all the data, the user is able to just use our application. Because here we just have anchor tags, links, forms. It's simple. I mean, if I click on a link, it's just doing a document request. So the user experience is not as good as if we had JavaScript, but it's totally fine. And just to show you that also the form still works because it's just a form. Another node. Let's submit it. And we can see here at the bottom that we did a post request, but in this case it's a document request, and that we got redirected. Here we have the 302 status code, which means that we are being redirected. And here we can see the new node. So everything still works. This is progressive enhancement. Yeah, so let's go back to the presentation. And I hope that I could give you a quick initial overview of the framework. And I wanted to share with you here in the talk 3 main ideas. The first one is that how powerful nested routes are. Remix is able to completely remove network waterfalls in the network when loading resources, which is nice to improve the experience. Also that with progressive enhancement, the mental model really is very simple. We just have a client-server model with actions and loader in the server, which are endpoints, and then React components on the client. Okay, so it's really simple. And also we are here, a nice benefit of this also is that we are giving access to at least the basic functionality of our application to every user. And from there, we improve the experience for the users that have devices or browsers that support those well, JavaScript or new features, right, of our application. And finally, that Remix is focusing just on web standards and features that are part of HTTP and HTML, so things like the fetch API, as we saw, links, form, nothing tricky, nothing complex, but it works great. And yeah, so basically if you are getting good at Remix, you are just getting good at the web. And yeah, that was everything. Thank you.